I thought my son's wedding would be the bridge that finally brought us back together. I'd been waiting for this day. His big day, our new beginning. But just hours before the ceremony, he looked at me and said, "That chair's reserved for my stepdad." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It wasn't just a chair. It was 20 years of missed birthdays, unanswered calls, and letters I thought he'd ignored. It was every effort I'd made to be part of his life, crushed into one sentence. People think I left and didn't care, but they don't know what really happened. They don't know what I've kept quiet all these years. I could have walked away forever. Instead, I stayed, long enough to see something that changed everything. Something that proved this wasn't just about a chair or a wedding. It was about the truth he was never told. And before this story ends, you'll see why, sometimes, the person you think is the villain isn't who you should be blaming at all. I was 58 years old when my son got married, but I could still remember the smell of motor oil from the factory floor where I spent most of my life. That smell paid the bills, bought groceries, and yes, it also covered the child support checks I sent every month for 2 decades. It was the price of being a man who left a marriage but tried not to leave his child. The divorce came when my son David was just 8 years old. His mother, Karen, had already started seeing another man, a steady guy named Mark. I wasn't the perfect husband. I worked too much, argued too often, and missed too many dinners. But when the court papers came, I signed where I needed to, thinking that the important part was making sure David was taken care of. Karen got full custody. David stayed in the house he'd grown up in. I moved 2 states away, chasing a better job that came with overtime and health insurance. Every other weekend visits turned into once a month, then every couple of months. I told myself it was just temporary, that he'd understand when he got older. I sent cards for his birthdays, Christmas, and Easter. I mailed him little things, baseball cards when I found a set he might like, a model truck kit when he turned 12. I told myself the lack of replies was because he was busy, because kids don't always write back. But deep down, every time my mailbox stayed empty, it stung. The years went on, and my role in his life became smaller, a quiet presence on the edges. I'd hear updates from Karen in short, business-like calls. He's doing fine. He's busy with school. He has a lot going on right now. Each sentence felt like a closed door. Still, I kept sending money, kept sending cards, kept hoping one day he'd call me just to talk. It wasn't until much later that I found out my cards almost never reached him. It started with a random encounter on a trip back to my old neighborhood. I'd stopped at a gas station when a woman waved at me from across the parking lot. It was Mrs. Parker, the woman who used to live next door to Karen. "I was wondering when I'd run into you," she said. "You know, I always thought it was strange David never mentioned those letters you sent." My stomach tightened. "Letters?" She looked surprised. "Oh, I saw you drop off envelopes in their mailbox more times than I can count when you came to visit. But I never heard him talk about getting them." I brushed it off at the time, not wanting to read too much into it. But her words stuck. On the drive home, I couldn't shake the thought. What if he never saw them? The next time I tried to call David, he didn't answer. Same as usual. But now, that silence felt heavier. Months later, during another trip, I stopped by the old neighborhood again. This time, I ran into another neighbor, Mr. Collins. He'd known Karen and Mark for years. Over coffee, he lowered his voice. "I probably shouldn't say this," he began. "But Mark, he always thought it was better for David not to get mixed messages. Said it was confusing for him to have two dads trying to play the same role." I stared at him. "Mixed messages? I'm his father." Collins gave a helpless shrug. "I'm just telling you what I heard. I think Mark saw himself as the stable one, you know? The one who was there every day." Something clicked into place. The missed calls, the unanswered letters, the way David always seemed distant when I visited. It wasn't just that I'd been far away physically. It was that someone had been building a wall between us. I left that conversation with a pit in my stomach. For years, I'd carried the weight of guilt, thinking I was the one who failed him. And maybe I did, in my own way. But now, for the first time, I wondered if the gap between us had been widened on purpose. Still, I didn't confront anyone. Not Karen, not Mark, not even David. I told myself it wouldn't matter, that stirring it up would only push him further away. But inside, something had shifted. I no longer believed our distance was just about me working too much or living too far away. There was something else, something unspoken, that had kept us apart. That suspicion sat quietly in the back of my mind for years, like a locked box I wasn't ready to open. Until the wedding. Until that one sentence about a chair. That was when the lock snapped open. By the time David was in high school, I had perfected the art of showing up quietly. I'd drive hours to make it to his milestones, the kind of events fathers are supposed to attend, but always as an observer, never as the center of attention. At his high school graduation, I sat 5 rows from the back. Karen and Mark were in the front, surrounded by relatives from her side of the family. I remember watching David cross the stage, his cap slightly crooked, his smile wide. My chest swelled with pride. I wanted to run down there, shake his hand, tell him how proud I was. Instead, I clapped politely from a distance, blending into a crowd of strangers. Afterward, I waited near the parking lot, thinking maybe I could get a moment alone with him. When he finally appeared, he was flanked by friends and family, laughter surrounding him like a shield. He saw me and smiled, polite, brief, almost formal. "Thanks for coming, Dad," he said. "It means a lot." It did mean a lot. But then he was whisked away for photos, and I was left standing in the shadow of the school building, my congratulations unsaid. I told myself it was fine. It was enough just to be there. Years later, I made the trip again for his college graduation. This time, it was a bigger stadium, a louder crowd. I arrived early, determined to find a good seat. But somehow, I still ended up far back, my view of the stage obscured by a sea of heads and camera flashes. After the ceremony, I approached him with a gift, an engraved watch I'd saved for. "That's nice," he said, hesitating for a moment before tucking it into his bag. He didn't wear it that day. At his birthday parties, on the rare occasions I was invited, it was the same. I'd be seated near the edge of the table, sometimes with co-workers of his or distant cousins, while Mark sat next to him, laughing, talking, clinking glasses. I didn't resent Mark exactly, but every time I saw him slip so easily into moments I could never access, it cut a little deeper. Still, I stayed patient. I kept thinking, one day there will be a moment for just us. One day he'll want me there in a way no one else can fill. That hope crystallized into something real the day I got his call. It was a Wednesday evening in late spring. I was in my kitchen, halfway through reheating leftovers, when the phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered anyway. Dad? For a moment I thought I'd misheard. David almost never called me. His voice was lighter than I remembered, maybe even nervous. I wanted to tell you in person, he said, but I'm getting married this summer, and I'd like you to be there. I stood there, frozen, microwave humming behind me. Of course, I said, my voice cracking despite myself. I wouldn't miss it for the world. His tone was friendlier than it had been in years. We spoke for nearly 20 minutes, a record for us. He told me about his fiancée, Emily, how they met at a conference, how she made him laugh in ways he hadn't laughed in years. There was no mention of seating arrangements or who would walk him down the aisle. Just an open invitation, one that felt like a door cracking open after being sealed shut for decades. For the first time in years, I let myself believe things might be changing. I threw myself into preparations. I bought a new suit, navy blue, tailored just enough to make me look like I belonged at the front, not tucked away in the back. I spent hours choosing the perfect gift, something that would show him how much I cared. I decided on a handcrafted wooden box with his initials carved into the lid, filled with letters I'd written over the years but never sent. Every night for weeks, I imagined the moment. Arriving at the church, shaking his hand, maybe even hugging him. I pictured him introducing me to Emily's family. I thought about where I'd sit. I never doubted it would be somewhere close enough to see his face clearly as he said his vows. The idea of being part of his day, not as an afterthought, but as a father, became my anchor. For the first time in years, the weight of the past felt lighter. Maybe all those missed moments, all the awkward silences, had been leading to this. Maybe the wedding wasn't just about him starting a new life. It was about us starting over too. The morning of the wedding, I woke earlier than I had in years. My suit was hanging on the back of the door, pressed to perfection. The navy fabric felt like armor when I slipped it on. The silk tie tightened like a promise. I'd rehearsed this day in my mind so many times, but nothing compared to the reality of driving toward the church, the sun glinting off the hood of my old sedan. I arrived an hour early, determined not to miss a single moment. The church was already buzzing with guests in pastel dresses and crisp suits, the scent of fresh flowers spilling into the warm summer air. I stood in the foyer for a moment, watching people greet each other, my eyes scanning for David. When I finally spotted him, he was across the room, looking sharp in his tuxedo. My chest swelled. This was my son, my boy who used to climb on my shoulders, now a man about to start his own family. I walked toward him, ready to shake his hand, maybe even pull him into a hug. "Dad," he said when he saw me, a polite smile on his face. "David," I replied, my voice full of pride. "You look incredible." He thanked me, glancing over my shoulder toward a group of guests. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to ask the question I'd been holding in for weeks. "Hey, I was wondering, where should I sit during the ceremony?" David's expression shifted, just slightly. "Oh, about that?" he said, lowering his voice. "The seat in the front row, the one next to Mom. It's reserved for Mark." I blinked, sure I'd misheard. "Reserved? For Mark?" He nodded, avoiding my eyes. "He's been there for me, all these years. I hope you understand." In that moment, the air seemed to thin. It wasn't just about a chair. It was about every mile I'd driven to graduations, every holiday I'd spent in the back row, every letter I'd sent without reply, all of it condensed into one polite dismissal. "Of course," I said, my voice tight. "I understand." But I didn't. I found my way to a seat halfway down the aisle, far enough that I could barely make out his expression at the altar. From that distance, it felt like I wasn't part of the ceremony at all, just another guest in a room full of strangers. The vows were beautiful, the music perfect, the smiles genuine. And yet for me, every word felt like a quiet confirmation. You are not the father who gets the front row. When the ceremony ended, I lingered outside, unsure whether to stay for the reception. I told myself I'd at least congratulate him. But as I stepped toward the side of the building to gather myself, voices drifted through an open window. It was David. "I know it's complicated," he was saying, "but Mark was the one who raised me. He was there every day. Dad, my biological dad. He showed up when he could, and I appreciate that. But the wedding, it just didn't feel right to put him in that seat." My stomach tightened. Another voice, one of his friends, asked, "Do you think he gets that? I mean, do you think he understands why?" There was a pause before David replied, "Probably not. I think he always saw himself as more involved than he actually was. Mom told me once that he moved away because he didn't want the responsibility. I don't know. Maybe that's true." I leaned against the wall, the words cutting deeper than I expected. It wasn't anger that hit me first. It was the realization that this wasn't defiance. It was belief. He truly thought I had chosen to step away. That was the twist of the knife. My absence wasn't just physical. It was rewritten history, and the storyteller had been someone he trusted. I walked back to my car, the sound of wedding laughter fading behind me. Every mile I drove away from the church, the weight in my chest grew heavier. For years I had blamed myself for the distance, and I wasn't blameless. I had left. I had missed moments. But now, for the first time, I saw the full shape of the wall between us. It wasn't just built from my mistakes. It was built from stories he'd been told, truths that had been bent until I barely recognized myself in them. I didn't know it then, but that overheard conversation would change everything. I drove away from the church with the windows down, the summer air rushing past, but doing nothing to cool the heat in my chest. The navy suit that had once felt like armor now felt like a costume, something I had worn to pretend I belonged in a place where I was never meant to stand. Every mile I put between myself and that wedding felt heavier. Anger rose and fell in waves. It wasn't just the chair. It wasn't even just the wedding. It was every moment I had swallowed disappointment to keep the peace. I thought about high school graduations, where I stayed in the shadows. Birthdays, where my presence was treated like a polite formality. Phone calls that went unanswered. All the times I told myself, at least I showed up. At least I was there in some way. But today proved that being there hadn't mattered, not in the way I'd hoped. At a red light, I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Part of me wanted to turn around, walk into that reception, and say everything I'd held back for years. But another part of me knew it wouldn't matter. Not unless the truth came out in a way he could see for himself. I drove without thinking, ending up in the old part of town near Karen's house. It was quiet, the way it always was in the afternoon, the sound of cicadas humming in the heat. That's when I remembered the boxes. After the divorce, Karen had kept a few of my things until I could pick them up. Over the years, I'd never made a point to collect them. They were just dusty remnants of a life I no longer had. Old work boots, tools, maybe a few photos. But sitting there in my car, something told me to finally go get them. I knocked on the door. Karen wasn't home, Mark either. But her sister, Linda, answered. She looked surprised to see me, but didn't argue when I asked about the boxes. "They're in the garage," she said, leading me to a corner stacked with cardboard. The boxes smelled of dust and time. I carried them to my car, telling myself I'd just toss most of it. But when I got home and opened the first box, I saw something that made my breath catch. Inside, tucked between an old jacket and a stack of yearbooks, was an envelope. The handwriting on the front was clumsy, uneven, like it had been written by someone still figuring out how letters fit together. My name was on it. I slid the letter out carefully. The paper was creased and yellowed at the edges. The date in the corner was almost 15 years old. "Dad," it began, "I don't know if you want to see me. Mom says you're busy. But I wish you could come to my baseball game next month. We're playing at the high school field. I don't care if you can't stay long. I just want you to see me play. I think I'm pretty good now. I hope you're okay." Signed, David. I sat there for a long time, the letter trembling in my hands. He had wanted to see me. He had reached out, and somehow, the letter had never made it to me. The anger I had felt at the wedding was nothing compared to the weight of that realization. This wasn't just about a chair at a ceremony. This was about a lifetime of moments stolen by silence and half-truths. The wedding was the breaking point, but the cracks had started years ago, and they had been widened, piece by piece, every time someone intercepted a letter or rewrote the story of why I wasn't there. I put the letter back in its envelope and sat at my kitchen table. My hands were steady now. The anger was still there, but it was sharper, focused. I couldn't undo the years we'd lost. I couldn't erase the beliefs he'd built about me, but I could show him the truth. For decades, I'd told myself to be patient, to let him come to me when he was ready. But patience had turned into silence, and silence had turned into distance. No more. This wasn't about forcing my way into his life. It was about making sure he knew the truth of the man he'd been told to forget. I looked at the letter one more time, before tucking it carefully into my jacket pocket. It wasn't just paper. It was proof. Proof that what he believed about me wasn't the whole story. I had no idea how he'd react. Maybe he'd be angry. Maybe he'd refuse to believe it. But I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to stay quiet anymore. The next time I saw my son, he was going to hear the truth, whether he wanted to or not. It took me 3 weeks to decide how I'd approach him. I didn't want to catch him off guard at work or show up at his home uninvited. In the end, I sent a simple text. "Can we meet for coffee? Just to talk. No pressure." Hours passed before the dots appeared. Sure, Saturday morning, 10 a.m. at Grant's Cafe. And when I walked into the cafe, David was already there, seated at a small table by the window. He looked older than I remembered, not just in years, but in the way he held himself. Guarded, careful. "Dad," he said when I sat down. His voice was polite, but cautious. The way you speak to someone you're not sure you trust. I didn't waste time with small talk. I reached into my bag and set a small stack of envelopes on the table. "These are letters I sent you over the years," I said. Birthdays, holidays, baseball games. Most of them never got to you, I think. He glanced at the envelopes, frowning. Dad. I held up my hand. I'm not here to blame you, but there's something you need to see. From the same bag, I pulled out a folder with copies of child support payments, records that spanned 2 decades. Then I placed the final piece on the table, the envelope I'd found in Karen's boxes. This one's from you, I said quietly. You wrote it when you were 15. I never saw it until a few weeks ago. He hesitated before opening it. His eyes scanned the page, his brow furrowing as he read his own words from years ago. Words asking me to come to a baseball game. Words saying he didn't care how long I stayed, just that I came. He set the letter down slowly. His jaw tightened. Where did you get this? In a box of my things from your mom's house, I replied. I think it was never sent. His eyes flashed, a mix of anger and confusion. So what? You're saying Mom kept us apart? That's your excuse for not being around? It's not an excuse, I said, my voice steady. I made mistakes, David. I worked too much. I moved away. But I never stopped trying. I thought you didn't want to see me. I didn't know there were letters like this. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. It sounds like you're trying to rewrite history. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I slid the stack of letters toward him. Read them. Every one of these was written when I thought you were getting nothing from me but child support checks. I thought silence was your choice. I didn't know it was being decided for you. He didn't touch them at first. But as the minutes passed, his eyes drifted toward the envelopes, then back to me. I don't know what to say, he muttered finally. You don't have to say anything, I replied. Just know that I never stopped wanting to be your dad. The air between us was heavy, years of distance hanging there like smoke. For a long time, he said nothing. Then he picked up the letter he'd written at 15 and read it again. This time, there was no anger in his expression. Just something more complicated, something like doubt. We sat there for nearly an hour, most of it in silence. When he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter. I grew up thinking you left because you didn't want the responsibility. That's what Mom said. And Mark, he was there. He showed up. I thought he was the one who cared. I don't blame you for feeling that way, I said. Mark was there in ways I couldn't be. But that doesn't mean I didn't care. It means the story you were told wasn't the whole truth. He looked down at the table, running a thumb over the edge of the envelope. I feel like I don't know what's real anymore. I leaned forward slightly. Then take your time to figure it out. I'm not here to force anything. I just wanted you to have the facts. What you do with them is up to you. He gave a small nod, his jaw still tense, but his eyes softer than they had been in years. For the first time in a long time, I saw a crack in the wall between us. It wasn't a collapse, not yet, but it was enough for light to get through. As we left the cafe, he hesitated at the door. Thanks for coming, Dad. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was more than I'd heard in a long time. And for now, that was enough. The weeks after our conversation at the cafe were quieter than I expected. I didn't hear from David right away, but I also didn't expect to. What we'd talked about wasn't the kind of thing that sank in overnight. Years of belief don't just unravel after one meeting over coffee. But a month later, my phone buzzed. It was a text from him. Lunch sometime next week? It wasn't an apology, but it was something. And when I showed up to that lunch, the conversation was different. He didn't act like everything was fine, but there was less distance in his voice. We talked about work, about his new house with Emily, about everyday things that didn't feel loaded with old resentment. That lunch turned into another, then another. Over time, we found ourselves meeting maybe once a month. Sometimes it was lunch, sometimes a game on TV, sometimes just a walk. There was no big speech about forgiveness, no dramatic moment where the past was wiped clean, but in the quiet way relationships often heal, the walls between us slowly began to lower. I never asked for a front row seat to his life anymore. I'd learned that chasing a position only led to disappointment. Instead, I focused on showing up when he offered space, making sure that when he looked for me, I was there. Not as a demand, but as a choice. One evening, while we sat on the back patio of his house, he mentioned something without looking at me. "I can't change how things were when I was a kid," he said, "but I guess I can choose how things are now." I didn't push for more. I just nodded. "That's all I've ever wanted, son. A chance now." He didn't look at me, but his shoulders loosened just slightly. Almost a year passed. By then, our meetings had become a quiet habit. I didn't see every corner of his life, but I was no longer a stranger. When Emily announced she was pregnant, he told me, not in a big family gathering, but over coffee, just the two of us. When the baby was born, I sent a gift, but didn't assume I'd be part of the celebrations. Old habits of caution die hard. So when I got a call from him 3 weeks later, I was surprised. "We're having a small gathering for the baby," he said. "Just close family. I'd like you to come." I agreed, keeping my expectations low. The day of the gathering, I drove to their house with a gift tucked under my arm. I told myself I'd be happy just to be in the same room, to see my grandchild from any seat. Inside, the living room had been rearranged into neat rows of chairs, facing a small table covered with decorations. I spotted Emily holding the baby, smiling at guests. David was near the front, talking to Mark. I hovered at the back, unsure where to sit, when David caught my eye. He walked over, his expression unreadable. "Hey, Dad," he said. "Come with me." He led me toward the front row. I hesitated, thinking he might be introducing me to someone. Instead, he stopped at a chair right up front, next to Emily's parents. "This one's for you," he said simply. I looked at the chair, then back at him. "Are you sure?" He nodded, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at his mouth. "Yeah, this one's for you, Dad." I sat down slowly, the words settling in my chest like something warm after a long winter. As the ceremony began, I realized this wasn't just about a chair. It wasn't about a wedding or a place in the front row. It was about the fact that for the first time in a long time, my son wanted me there. Not as an obligation, but as family. Later, as the guests mingled and the baby was passed from one set of arms to another, David came over. "I can't promise I'll get everything right," he said quietly. "But I think I understand more now. About you. About all of it. I didn't need an apology. The fact that he wanted me here now said enough. I'm just glad to be here," I told him. And for the first time in decades, it felt true. Not because I was in the front row, but because I was where I was supposed to be.